Hey there, folks. Welcome to today's episode of the SME Strategy Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about conflict being an opportunity. And today, my guest is Dana Caspersen. I'm so excited to talk about this topic in executive boardrooms, in strategy sessions, in small meetings. Conflict arises big and small, and we've got an expert to talk about how to manage it and deal with it. Dana, thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
I'm so excited. So one of the things that I talk about with folks when I'm not exactly sure how it's going to go, and I say, let's dance. Let's dance in this conversation. And I know dance is very familiar to you. So how is conflict and dancing very close and similar together?
Yeah, when I initially began working in conflict, I had been already a performing artist for many, many years, and I didn't see them as connected. But over time, I've come to realize there's really they're already connected in that conflict is a creative space. But oftentimes we think of it as a space to avoid any cost or something to fight our way through. And in fact, it's this place where there's really is this opportunity for things to emerge and get on the table. And as a performer, as a dancer, you are navigating always kind of a chaotic environment where there's all these elements that seem oppositional. And the work of a dancer is to say, okay, I'm going to hold these things together because there is no movement without tension. And so how do we let the tensions themselves be the source of really important information? So a dancer moves through, finds the line that helps the viewer figure out what's going on. In the same way in conflict, we can be present with these things that are, they're not easy and they're uncomfortable. And yet they're there for a reason, that these tensions are there because something matters to people, something's important. And if we can hold them together long enough to figure out what's going on, we can then figure out better how to move forward.
Awesome. And my understanding is your background is ballet or your mode of dancing. So when I use it, obviously, or I might, for those who know that I'm 6'3" and 260 pounds. So I'm sure there are ballerinas, male ballerinas that dance like that. But when I think of it in dancing in tandem. And one of the questions I had was around conflict, but conflict up. So, for example, let's say there's a CEO who isn't the easiest to deal with, and you can notice the tension that you talked about when the CEO is in the room versus not. How can executive teams work with their CEOs where that tension or conflict exists? How can they work through that as an opportunity?
Yeah. So notice the difference between blaming the CEO and looking at the overall situation. So for the team to take a step back and say, okay, we might be initially starting out with this framing of the thing that's like, he's impossible, and I don't know how we're going to deal with him.
Or she.
Yeah. To step it back to say, okay, so how do we frame what we're talking about here? What is where is the area where difficulties are emerging? And how do we name those difficulties in a way that involves the other person as well, so that we can say, okay, hey, we've noticed there's some tension going on when this particular thing happens. We're curious to get a better sense of what's happening from everyone who's involved. How about if we have a conversation about what people are experiencing here, what we might look at going forward, so that we figure out what the question is between you, not who's to blame. Oftentimes that's the main thing, is being willing to acknowledge other people's experience and concerns, and then also to be able to name your own concerns in a way that's not based on attack, defensiveness, or blame.
Yeah. And I think it's so important. The situation versus the person, what is happening, the perspectives, the not pointing and making it that person's fault, but looking at it collectively. And so, in my understanding, and I am not an expert, but it is situationally, right? And it requires a lot of trust to be able to go through that conflict. So in that moment, it's a lot easier to blame. It's a lot easier to say it's their fault. And you kind of, in my understanding, is you need a bit of trust to do that. How can you create space to have those conversations when somebody has a lot of power over you in that situation, to be able to bring up something as uncomfortable as, an issue?
Yeah. So the thing is that oftentimes there's a concern that we all have to be on the same page in order to make our way through a conflict. And yet the thing in conflict is that everyone's in it because they care about something. So if you can again get back to this thing of what is the question between us, and that the question that you imagine is between you also includes them. So that when the conversation comes up, it's not about, okay, so every time you do this, this is the problem and you're the problem, but getting back to opening up trust by removing blame, by making it really clear that this is something we're figuring out together. This is not something that we're putting on you that you have to figure out or that we're going to figure out and jam down your throat, but rather it becomes this space that's like, okay, so hey, I noticed this thing is going on. I'd like to get a better sense of it. I'm curious what you're thinking. So first of all, inviting the other person to say what they're thinking, acknowledge what they're thinking without sarcasm or sneaky defensiveness, to say like, okay, so it sounds like from your perspective, you're experiencing this and your sense is this. Is that right? Checking in and then saying, all right. And at the same time, which is a really useful phrase because it holds together two experiences. At the same time, I'm seeing this happen. And I'm curious, if we could have a conversation about what it means for us to look at this overall situation. So the trust doesn't need to be, of course, it's better if it's there in advance, but a trust can emerge when the person gets a sense that you're not in it to get them, that you're not there to attack them or undermine them, but rather with this real curiosity. And I think that's one of the main things, is that developing this robust curiosity, like a strong one that's not going to just get washed away when you're stressed out, but to be able to say like, okay, this is not easy, but here I am. Listen, I'm really curious about this. would love to have a conversation around this. I'm concerned about this. I'm wondering what you're thinking, so that it becomes this place of inquiry and it becomes a kind of request instead of a demand, which is a really important differentiation.
I think for some CEOs who aren't curious, they are more command and control. Let's call it dictatorial, but probably not the right word you only use in 2025. That like you have to be curious to be able to see the other side, because, the perspective is reality. If as a leader, any leader, whatever seat you have, if you're saying it is my way is correct, you're kind of washing away the opportunity for that collaboration, that getting on the same page. There's no invitation. It is a directive. And I just find it interesting. So inviting, acknowledging, and then holding the two concurrent or multiple spaces of reality at the same time, acknowledging it, respecting it, and not playing it down. Did I capture most of that? Anything I missed?
Yeah. And then from there to be really curious about what don't I understand yet? And I think this point about request and demand is a really important one for leaders to consider, because there's no right way to do things. There's different consequences to what you do. And if you make a demand of somebody, you've put them in a situation where they really only have two options: comply with you or defy you. And those options are both kind of disempowering. And a request can initially feel kind of nerve-wracking to a leader, because it feels like maybe I'm giving away my power. Maybe I'm kind of like looking weak. And yet ultimately a request is, it's like an investigative tool that you say, okay, here's what's important to me. Here's what I'm wondering. Is this something you'd be willing to do? And if the person says no, it's not that they're saying no to you. It's that they're giving you new information. So a request is a way to get new information. Then you can say, oh, okay, so it sounds like that doesn't work for you. What is it about that doesn't work? Let's get back to looking at what matters to you and me. And then each time we put out a request or an idea, we get more information. So it's really this expansive sense of leadership, which is not about I need to know what's right and I need to do it, but instead, what is the overall landscape that we're in? What don't I understand yet? What will help me understand that? Given that we have like a distributed power, everybody has power of some kind, even when there's a hierarchy. How can we activate that power through the kinds of ideas that we support, through the way that we work together? So the way we work together is indicative of the ideas that we're holding. Yeah. And that makes a big difference in whether people feel empowered or whether they feel like you're just blowing them off and then they get resentful.
Yeah, and then that has cascading effects. I do want to ask you about the cost of avoiding conflict, so not having those conversations, but I don't want to lose what don't I understand? It's such a great, curious question, even for a leader or an individual or somebody in a relationship. You just think, hey, is there more to the story that I'm not seeing, without actually saying, hey, I'm going to put myself in the other person's shoes? And then again, I think of or the bilateral comply or don't, it is such a
Hmm.
constrictive space. Again, thinking of that dancing example, if you are only
Yeah.
doing one of two things, there's no freedom, there's no looseness, there's no opening. It is just narrowing to that win-lose space, and it doesn't really work. So I'm loving where this is. So costs of avoiding conflict. What are the costs of not being curious? Costs of not having those conversations? The cost of not eating the frog, doing the things you need to do as a group.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, it's what we just talked about. You're going to be missing a lot of information, and you're going to be trying to make unilateral decisions without all of the info that you need. And so the solutions that you come up with when they're unilateral are usually going to be less effective than they would be if you understood what's going on for other people. So also, it's harder to understand really what decisions need to be made if you don't know what's going on. And there tends to be a rise up of simmering resentment. And then there tends to be explosions when conflict's not dealt with. And another thing that happens, especially if leaders are avoidant, um, important issues don't get dealt with. So then the people around them start to make these kind of ad hoc structures to try to deal with the fact that the solutions haven't been dealt with. And so you get these backroom situations going on that are not effective in the long run. The leader is then insulated from really understanding the consequences of their choices, and then it just perpetuates itself. So it's a loss of freedom because you're not really moving, like you say, you're moving in a constricted space. It's a loss of information. It's a loss of relationship because if people are not able to deal with the things that come up between them, they start to separate more and they become more and more afraid of talking to each other. And then what matters never really gets spoken of.
Absolutely. So for our listeners, many of know, our job at SME Strategy, we facilitate strategic planning sessions. So we lock these leaders in a room, doors never locked, for 2-3 days to have these conversations. And what I find is interesting is, as you were talking about, like that simmeringness, that, backroom conversations, is that, you're starting to get those pieces of information even if folks aren't in the conversation because it's happening between other people, that information is being relayed, that understanding. And so you said, well, it's not always about being on the same page, but being able to see the cascading but kind of exponential impact of micro decisions at scale. If those can go unchecked for too long, you've got variant processes, different structures, all of those kind of things. Whereas, the alignment opportunity of going through a strategic planning process with SME Strategy or otherwise, it just has a really great upside for the business. So the book is called Conflict is an Opportunity. What do you want to say about that? What don't our listeners, or might our listeners not know about conflict, the opportunity that it presents for themselves and for their organizations?
Yeah, so what's important to me over the years I've noticed is that there's no right way to do conflict, and any kind of a formulaic approach tends to backfire because it pisses people off, it feels inauthentic, and it also just kind of fails over time. And what tends to support people in conflict is to really develop your own capacity to be able to see where you are, to get that information on the table, to understand what decisions are yours to make, and then to consciously make them. Because a lot of times we're making these decisions unconsciously, and then we're just falling back on habit. So there's this opportunity that's in conflict for us to become more conscious of ourselves, of the people we're with, of how we're interacting, how we might interact. And so this book is really oriented toward, it's kind of a work, like a companion that can help you when you're stuck in a conflict or when you're trying to prepare for a conflict, to look at it and say, okay, where are the decisions that are mine to make, and how can I make these consciously? So becoming not afraid of stepping into the mess of conflict, because it is a big mess, because you know that you're able to navigate it, because you know that you're able to say, okay, right now I'm feeling kind of stuck. Let me look at this from a different angle. Let me figure out what decisions I've made that have gotten me in this stuck place, and let me kind of free myself by making more conscious decisions in all of these different areas.
And it sounds like that is a skill, but a learned one. It's not, like you said, it's not a practical to do these things. It is an ever evolving capacity or ability to be able to both be present, and then the awareness to not be triggered, or what other word, to be able to have that thought process as you go through. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and what I find really interesting is that we're already making all these decisions. So it's not like we have to decide, okay, I am now going to begin a conflict engagement process and I'm going to do the right things. But instead it's a matter of awareness of like, oh, right. What am I paying attention to? What am I primarily connected to? What request might I have? What am I responding to? What's the question between us? What kind of organizational structures are in place? How's that impacting me? Are we using punishment and reward as ways to control people? What constructive change is this proposing? So all of these questions that we're already answering consciously or unconsciously are shaping our lives and our relationships and our conflicts. So we're already in it. And so the choice is to become more conscious and have more capacity as individuals and as groups.
Yeah, I have a 2.5-year-old at home. So I don't know if these rules 100% apply, but I'm sure I'm going to, be more curious as we go through and at least,
Yeah.
Okay, let's say everybody listening here never has any conflict. They're never the problem, but they may have folks around them that either gossip or complain. So let's say, people come to them and say, hey, how do I deal with this problem? Re-conflict. Obviously, by the book is the first choice. Second choice, if you were supporting somebody or coaching somebody through helping others through conflict, how would you approach that? Because it's hard to just say, well, be more mindful. It's like, no, I tried it. What would you say to folks needing to coach others or support others through conflict?
Yeah. So to help them unpack so that they can get down to this level of what matters with simple questions like, okay, so what's the most important thing for you in here? And oftentimes what people do is they jump straight to strategies. Well, obviously the most important thing is that we need to do this. This needs to happen. Okay, so that's what would that help with? Which is another kind of question to get them away from strategies and back down to be able to say, well, I just feel like I really need more autonomy in this process. Okay, so you're really looking for more autonomy. So helping them rather than telling them what to do, which literally almost never works, and helping them understand what it is that matters to them and to be able to articulate it in a way that's not about attack. So instead of them going to their person and saying, oh my God, you're such a control freak. This is ridiculous. I can't work with you anymore. To help them say, okay, what matters to you? Or it seems like autonomy is important to you. I'm going to express that without attack might sound like, you notice I'm finding myself feeling frustrated. So coming from their own experience with the way that we've structured this process, I really feel like I'd like to have more decision-making power. I'm wondering what you would think about that. And if we could have a conversation about what that might look like if we looked again at how we make decisions in this project. So helping the people get away from strategies, get to what matters to them, to be able to express without attack, and to notice when they're getting caught up in defensiveness. And that's okay, but just notice it. And then say, okay, so maybe defensiveness is kind of making it harder to express yourself. What would it sound like if you were super curious and you didn't attack? What might that sound like? So those kind of questions can help. What might that look like?
I love the Socratic thinking, the disarming by saying, hey, here's a hypothetical situation.
Yeah.
Just allows people to put themselves in a new mindset and then grounding them back to the why, not the what or the how, supporting them and just, again, reframing everything. Okay, as we finish up here, what questions should I have asked you? What would you like people to know? What would surprise people about conflict, interpersonal relationships? Anything else that you want to share? The floor is yours.
One thing that I think is really, really useful to think about is that we all have some kind of power at all times. And oftentimes it seems like in conflict that we're only in combative space where we're against each other with our power. And in fact, we can build power together, even with the people that we're in conflict with. And we can do that by looking at all these decisions that we're making, by acknowledging them, what they need as well. Because it's like when you're dancing, if you have tension between your hands with your partner, you can do things that you could never do by yourself. So you're missing a lot of information if you don't also engage the other person's power by engaging their best self, by coming to them with your best self to say, hey, what's going on? What might be possible here? How can we move toward that?
And going back to dancing, but I was thinking about at the individual level, if you are on a stage and you are solo, the work is really with yourself. It's your own internal tension, or release to be able to act powerfully in the world. And so these techniques are really practiced for you to be in control of your mind, of your emotions, of your communication, which will ultimately just help you be a better performer in the world, whatever that world is, whether that's corporate, relationship, family, or otherwise. So Dana, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It was such a blast. I just really enjoyed our conversation. So thanks for sharing and for writing the book.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Folks, my guest today, Dana Caspersen, the author of Conflict is an Opportunity. Really, it's just the ability for you to pause, take those seconds, not as a directive, but just to have the awareness to be able to support not only you, but the folks in your circle by reframing, by re-understanding, and being curious in all of these things. So I encourage you to pick up the book, connect with Dana online. She's written more than one book. I'll let you do your research. But I appreciate you being on the show. If you like today's episode, please feel free to like and share. If you know somebody who is going through conflict, you can express without attacking that they should read this book. I hope it helps you in your journey as a leader. So once again, my name is Anthony Taylor. This has been the SME Strategy Podcast. I appreciate you, and I'll see you next time.